Hello, my name is Nathan Lott. I'm the Policy Research Director and Advocacy Coordinator for the Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans. If you've traveled around our city's historic neighborhoods lately, you've probably noticed a profusion of yard signs popping up in neutral grounds and in front of houses. That's because 2021 is an election year in New Orleans. With Congress and the state legislature not on the ballot, our municipal races will take center stage. As the saying goes, all politics is local. And that's especially true in preservation, because local governments regulate what gets built, where, and what gets torn down. Our city council plays a key role in preservation, zoning, and land use decisions. That's why PRC has launched a special voter education initiative to help our members and neighbors feel informed and inspired to head to the polls on November 13th. You can head over to prcno.org and read verbatim responses to a questionnaire on cultural and historic preservation from 18 candidates seeking district seats on the council. All 7 seats are up for grabs this year, but the most hotly contested is at-large Division 2. It's a citywide race for an open seat on the council. Because all voters in New Orleans may cast a ballot in the race, we opted to sit down with the frontrunners for an extended conversation on key issues facing our city's historic neighborhoods. My conversation with JP Morrell took place in late September 2021. I started out by asking what inspired the former state senator to run for the at-large city council seat.
As you know, I was a state senator for 13 years. Being in Baton Rouge for 13 years certainly gave me a lot of perspectives on how government can and can't work. And Baton Rouge at times can be a very difficult place to work, but for the most part, with the exception of the horrific Jindal years, we pretty much kept the wheels on the car and everything moved generally in the right direction, avoiding catastrophic failure. In the alternative, New Orleans has been pretty bad about not avoiding catastrophic failure. As you've seen, when you think about government as a whole, as you learn about it in civics class when you're in high school or junior high or even in college, the idea of government is that people get together as a group in a town or a city or a village, and they create government to do the things that people cannot do alone. Things like providing streets or clean running water, things like providing safety through police forces and firefighters, things like trash pickup, for example. These are all the things that individuals, they're incapable of doing in a large scale way. So they surrender money, they surrender rights and responsibilities to government to accomplish those things. As a citizen of the city, because I'm a citizen, I'm no longer an elected official, the city pretty much fails at all that stuff. They fail at sanitation, as we've all experienced recently. That failure of sanitation dated back 18 months. It's came to a head recently, but it's been a problem. Sewage and water board's been a perennial issue, and drainage have been issues probably for several decades. We've had sewage and water board problems. Crime is a perennial problem that's existed in the city since the beginning of time, but in these last couple of months, up till Ida, because Ida has kind of created an artificial lull, crime has been really out of control. I mean, people were and are getting still carjacked at gas pumps while they're pumping gas. When you think about what government's supposed to be, why we pay the taxes, why we surrender this authority to a council of people to represent our interests, the city has failed at it. And not only that, when the city does lumber to activity, it is always to react to a problem, not to proactively solve it. As a legislator, my time in the legislature, I spent a lot of time solving problems before they actually became problems. And I think part of the challenge that people have with the council in particular, where I'm running for New Orleans City Council, is that expectations have become so low for council members that they just don't expect them to do anything. And so it's a combination of kind of voter apathy and misinformation, and the fact that council is not an active council. For example, and you'll appreciate this, when I was marching with those individuals who were objecting to City Hall going to the municipal auditorium, which I'm sure every preservationist group is vehemently against the destruction of the historic treme for a City Hall. And I'm marching with these individuals in this parade, this marched against the city. And I'm marching with a couple of guys, probably in their mid-30s, a little younger than me. And they're lamenting the fact that the mayor is doing this horrific thing and the council is powerless to stop them. And I stopped these two guys and I said, hey, guys, you realize the council could rezone this building tomorrow and she couldn't do anything. And they looked at me stupefied. They were like, what? And I was like, the council could get together and just rezone the building. They could rezone the building. They could do a text amendment, because really this entire ridiculous city hall plan is based upon a bad interpretation of the text for office spaces for parks. Like, there's so much the council could do. And Nathan there, and they did not understand what the power of the council was. And that's fundamentally how I feel people complain about the mayor, and the council's really devolved into this kind of peanut gallery where if the mayor does something popular, they rush to agree with her. And if the mayor does something negative in the fallout, they complain about it, but the council does not have its own agenda to promote anything. And as someone who's lived in the city for my entire life, I'm 43 years old, I've seen councils on the gradient, some that are active, some that are not. This is the least active council I've ever seen. And it's a real missed opportunity in that when you see things like, we wasted 3.5 months fighting over Misplayatorium when the council could have just rezoned it. And to add insult to injury, the action they finally did, and you guys know this because you follow zoning, an interim zoning district is BS. An interim zoning district by definition expires. Mm-hmm. So people were misled thinking that when an IZD was dropped, it was over. An IZD just put the issue after the election. And voters don't even realize that after this election's over with, that Misplayatorium issue has not gone away. It simply moved past the period where voters would have had the greatest leverage to finally resolve it. Because, you know, once the elections are passed, politicians go back to do whatever the hell they want to do to begin with. And I have no doubt, based upon the mayor's commentary, that she has not given up on Misplayatorium as a location. She's been very candid about, she gave those poor activists in the Treme, 90 days to create a plan that the city's already spent millions of dollars making. So circling back to the beginning, the council is a very powerful council. It's one of the most powerful councils in municipal government in the state of Louisiana. It's completely underutilized, completely misunderstood. And as a citizen, my frustration has reached a level that I believe that it should not be so hard to live in the city we all love, and the council needs to be a leader in creating a city where we can all live and thrive. And that's why I'm running for city council.
Well, that's great. Yeah, you just touched on one of the points I wanted to make and questions I wanted to ask. You know, as the city's chief land use authority, the council has all this routine business that includes rezoning and conditional uses and demolition requests, either appeals of the Historic District Landmarks Commission or direct demolition requests that come in for National Register districts that are not under HDLC. They go straight to the city council. I think a lot of people don't know that or encounter that until it's happening with their personal property or the property next door. So you've just touched on this, but I wanted to hear, you know, how does that sort of land use work intersect with your goals for New Orleans?
Well, I think that when you look at the city as a whole, and you can't really talk about land use without talking about kind of the affordable housing crisis and the challenges we have as a city in supplying affordable housing stock to the people that want to live here, many of which who live here but are being priced out of the city. And there's a tremendous opportunity. We have about 25,000 blighted properties in the city of New Orleans that are houses that, historic or not, are still there, but are not back in commerce or in use. And the council has really dropped the ball on that. Many people, including myself 16 years ago, post Katrina, were right to return people. We thought everybody should have that right to come back to their home. There's no one I've met, old or young, rich or poor, black or white, 16 years out, who believes that's a thing anymore. I think that you have a lot of properties throughout the city, in particular historic properties, that if they're not salvaged or saved soon, they will not be savable. And these are properties where you've got neglected, you've got people who took option 2 or 3 from the road home, took the maximum money, relocated, submitted that they were going to rebuild, but they never rebuilt. They're never coming back. And those houses are stuck in kind of a limbo. And even when those houses are purchased up through a tax sale, what you're seeing increasingly is that you have investors who buy up properties in whole swaths and don't do anything with them. They basically make sure the windows are boarded with plywood and that it's not immediately falling onto their neighbor, but they just don't do anything beyond that. The city has to be infinitely more aggressive on getting those properties back into commerce, because there are individuals right now, especially when you talk about like the community land trust model, even with affordable housing, where you could really take some of those properties, the ones that are still in really good shape, the historic ones, and return them to commerce in a reasonable way for a family in an affordable way, so that people who want to be in a home can have a home. But the longer the city takes on doing that, the longer the council kind of gives up that authority to a mayor and to a safety and permits department to kind of get around to it. They're going to be properties that we could have saved 10 years ago. We could save 16 years out, that when you get to 2025 years, it literally is no longer functional. It's just completely collapsed upon itself. So when it comes to land use, the city council, they often hope that HDLC or that the other relevant committees like the Board of Zoning and the like, that they'll do their job for them, and that they will rule on things and avoid the council having to be involved. What you often see is that happens more often than not, but in the most egregious cases, they always go to the council, because the people with enough money and resources who just want to do what they want to do, they're the ones that get to go to the council and try and push those buttons to get it done a certain way. I think the public is not educated enough on what's going on in their neighborhoods. I think the nature of council meetings in itself is kind of flawed, and that council meetings happen at 11 a.m. on a Thursday. There's not a single person who has a job or has a family that's available at 11 a.m. on a Thursday, for example. I think there has to be an inherent flexibility, especially when it comes to zoning matters, that if something's truly controversial, the council should hear it at a 5 p.m. on a Tuesday or a 6 p.m. on a Friday. Like, there has to be a flexibility to make sure people can interact with government on these issues that are really important issues that are very controversial. Because I can tell you that from what I've seen as a citizen looking in, it is worse than the legislature, and that the legislature is kind of beleaguered by legions of lobbyists who come in and kind of make their position for their client, and the public's unable to interact. The city council is almost worse in that, at least at the legislative level, you often have two parties that are polar opposites in regards to like an issue like gun control. Gun control, you'll have the NRA and mothers and mothers, was it the mothers, can't remember the organization right now. Everytown USA, NRA will butt heads, but you'll hear both sides of an argument. When you're dealing with a zoning issue, usually you hear the architect who's like, this is fine. I mean, HDLC said no, but let me tell you why it's okay. You don't ever get a chance to hear the neighbor being like, my family's lived next to this house for generations. It's been this certain way. This is indicative of the 5 other houses you've passed on. Like, that person, there is no natural person available at every opportunity to provide that counter argument. And that's because the nature of the council is that it's better situated for people with a profit motive to influence what it does.
Yeah, I certainly see that some property owners or would-be developers can hire attorneys and architects and engineers and have access to the sort of professional cadre of people to represent them, and that's their right, and that's fine. But they are paid representatives. They are not necessarily speaking strictly from a sort of abstract or professional opinion that is unbiased at all. And I think about the way some certain state regulations are made. There are oftentimes public comment meetings that take place in the evenings, apart from the vote or the final decision made by a regulatory agency. So there's definitely potential to adopt that model, as you're saying, on really high profile issues where the council could have a public hearing. It wouldn't necessarily have to take a vote, but an evening public hearing on a complicated matter like the municipal auditorium or future of Armstrong Park, at which all council members were present, I think that would do a lot in terms of accessibility to the affected neighborhoods. So in addition to the land use role that the city council plays, city council also has some other responsibilities, notably budgeting, the power of the purse. That's pretty common, and uniquely or relatively uniquely in New Orleans, utility regulation. Not a lot of local councils get to be the primary utility regulator unless they have a municipal utility. And of course, economic development and then broader quality of life issues are things that fall to the city council. So talk a little about where your skills and passion fit in with that side of the job description.
Well, I mean, with economic development, the city of New Orleans has really not done a great job of diversifying the economy in an active way. From the state level, we've done things like, historic tax credits, digital media tax credits, film tax credit. These have all kind of created indigenous industries growing up out of the ground to kind of diversify us away from tourism. But the city does not participate in creating its own initiatives to foster that. Let me give you an example. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the Industrial Development Board. City of New Orleans has an industrial development board that's kind of like our clearinghouse for property tax exemptions and credits and incentives to push people to develop certain things. Mm-hmm. When I talk about how government is so reactive, the only people that utilize the Industrial Development Board for the most part are condominium developers who want to develop condos. Occasionally, you'll see a little bit of manufacturing. Occasionally, you'll see some large piece of commercial blight, but this is a tremendous resource that could be coupled with those indigenous industries we're trying to grow to promote growth. For example, we have 2 film studios in New Orleans. We have Second Line Stages and we have Starlight Studios in New Orleans East, both of which were built with no help from the Industrial Development Board. When you look at things like the digital media credit, which got DXC to come here, when you look at Ascent to come here, when you look at stuff like In Exile and High Voltage Entertainment that do video game development in the city of New Orleans, we don't look at what resources we could bring to the table to create a more fertile environment for those kind of developments. When you talk about utility regulation, I'm going to kind of hop around, but it's all connected. We have the worst internet and broadband access of any city of our size in the United States, as far as like reliability. We have a singular, really, internet provider in Cox Communications because of their kind of functional monopoly with the way cable is run. And internet is historically unreliable, very expensive, and just not available in any kind of coherent way in every resource. When you're looking at economic development and how the council could impact that, we really should have an open franchise for all internet and broadband providers to provide the most reliable and cheapest internet access to the entire city of New Orleans. Why is that important? When you go back, let's say, to film, post-production for a film is not done in New Orleans because our internet is crap. Oh, and when Hollywood is doing post-production on a large, big film, they take huge chunks of data that they develop locally, and they have to go back and forth with hubs in Georgia or in Hollywood to kind of do cuts and do adjustments. If you have crap internet, they take that post-production information, they fly to Georgia, fly to Hollywood, and spend millions of dollars in post-production because we don't have the resources to provide it. We can't develop a workforce here without internet. We can't grow new tech industries because those companies that want to compete with doing high-end upscale development, they struggle to make sure, especially if you're outside of downtown New Orleans, which if you're a startup company, it's cost prohibitive to start up out of the CBD. I mean, if you're High Voltage or In Exile, yeah, there's fiber in the CBD, but you're also paying tens of thousands of dollars for rent for your space. What you want to be is you want to be a place. During COVID, New Orleans was one of the greatest destinations for remote work. People flew in and lived here for a couple of months during COVID because their employer said, we don't care where you are, do your remote work. What other cities saw and their benefit was many people as their companies converted to remote work, they stayed in the places they liked. We didn't keep anybody in New Orleans because they liked being here, but the challenges with infrastructure made it impossible to stay. And so when it comes to internet, when it comes to a variety of different things for development, internet is part of the development piece. Regulation of utility is tied to the development piece. I mean, unreliable energy is a huge problem. We as a public have become accustomed to the fact that if it rains real hard, sometimes you lose power. Now, if you go to any other city in the United States, that's not something people expect, that during a hard rain, the power is going to go out. It's sort of like how in the city, if it rains really hard, we expect our streets to flood. That's not how other cities in the United States operate. The power going out and the streets flooding is the exception, not the rule. Because as a city, we've adopted a mentality that that's just the way things are. We've kind of allowed mediocrity to take root and spread, in that since that is the bar you hold government to, there is no incentive for it to go above that. If people accept bad power and accept flooding streets, then you're not incentivizing the sewage and water board to not work with a sense of urgency to solve your drainage problem, and you're not holding energy to account, or the council as their regulator, to make your power generation more reliable. Generally speaking, the council, like I said previously, has a tremendous amount of power separate from the mayor to implement policy. When you look over the last 4 years, the last 8 years in particular, I dare people to name any policy on any of the issues I just discussed they actually championed and did. And they don't do anything, because as a council, they don't feel it necessary, and they don't see the problems that exist in the city with the sense of urgency that I do as a person. When I was in the legislature, whenever I saw a problem, whether it be someone going to cut a tax credit that funded programs and jobs that I saw in the New Orleans area, whether it be non-unanimous juries convicting people and putting them in jail for life with 10 out of 2 jurors, I ran towards problems to solve them, especially when I thought that it was something I was even remotely capable of resolving. The city council for years runs away from problems. They've had 2 meetings in July and a week ago on sanitation regarding the sanitation crisis. Both meetings resulted in nothing. No real solution was brought up to solve the ongoing sanitation issue, other than to continue the triage that currently exists. When you talk about economic development, when I talk to my friends who have a company here and trying to lure more people down here, just in the last month, they've heard friends tell them, I was going to come down there, but you guys have no power and no one picks up the trash. Why would I move my business to a city where picking up trash isn't a priority? Power reliability is not a priority. Oh, and by the way, the internet's terrible. Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
Everything that we fail to do in government, all those basic things I talked about in my introduction about why government exists, when government gets to a certain level of dysfunction, people don't want to associate it with it. For those of us who live in the city and love it, we're always going to be here as long as we can. But part of a city not dying on a vine, part of a city not becoming the next Detroit, is that it's not about me. I'm 43 years old. I'm invested here. My wife and I, we live here. My 13-year-old son, when he's 18, he doesn't have to live here. And if he goes away to college and sees somewhere better, he may not come back. Those are the generations we're going to leave if we don't change the direction of the city. And that's how Detroit died. There's a reality that in 10, 15 years, we could have a functional French Quarter, a functional port, a functional CBD, and a semi-functional uptown, and the rest of the city be dead.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I've often, in thinking about how we address things like affordable housing, which you mentioned earlier, there is a lot of national attention to places like the Valley outside of LA, or San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where the nature of their housing crisis is very different. It truly is that they've had a population boom and they have, a supply constraint of not enough units. But as you pointed out, we have this, tremendous resource that's untapped in the form of vacant housing units that are just deteriorating in pretty much every neighborhood of the city. So, a lot of our peer cities are places like Baltimore or Cleveland or Detroit, Rust Belt cities, older cities that have dealt with the struggles of population decline and maintaining infrastructure, not adding it, at the pace of a rapidly growing city. So sometimes, yeah, I do think that people, particularly in land use and planning, but probably citywide and economic development, sometimes look to the wrong cities as our example. And as a result, we maybe don't learn the lessons that we could learn from other cities that are sometimes called legacy cities that are historic, but face some of the challenges.
I mean, a great example, and I had this conversation with the people in Treme about the Claiborne overpass, is that people want to, New Orleans is a fantastic small city. It's not a large sprawling, we're not Houston, we're not Atlanta. We're more like Charleston in a lot of ways. Like that's more of a peer city as far as functionally how it operates. And I gave an example. I said, people are kind of torn between, do we tear down the Claiborne underpass or do we like fix it? And if you've been to Charleston, you've seen how they built like these forests under their underpasses as a way to kind of recapture it so that the nature of the overpass over a neighborhood isn't negatively impacting the neighborhood on either side of the underpass. And to your point, I think sometimes, though we want to punch it in the weight class of Miami or Las Vegas, they're super heavyweights and we're a welterweight when it comes to that kind of competition. We're more of a Charleston kind of Nashville level. And when we look to solutions for problems, you'll often see, especially with some of the nonprofits, they go, well, here's what's happening in Los Angeles. And it's like, that's not a one-for-one fix, because the resources they have available in that state and that city to address that problem will never be the level of resources we'll have here. And when you look at, for example, crisis intervention units like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, Eugene's tiny. Trying to adopt the model where we do crisis intervention as an alternative to police officers going out to people in mental health crisis, that's not insurmountable. We could do that. It would cost money, but we could do it, especially considering the place we're looking to borrow it from is similarly situated to us. So to your point, like part of looking at solutions to problems, especially outside the city of New Orleans, is making sure the scale that you're looking at is a similar scale to us, because New York can throw money at a problem. They can literally just throw as much money as possible at the problem to solve said problem. We are not a city where we are so cash flush that if a problem pops up, we can just throw enough money at it till it goes away. We have to fundamentally change how we fund government. And to your earlier question, part of this question about the budget for me is a tremendous missed opportunity. I know from being in the legislature, because we have a very similar relationship with the legislature and the governor, council, and the mayor. The legislature rewrites the budget. The governor puts up a budget that he believes to be the budget for the state of Louisiana. The legislature, as the controller of the purse, looks at its priorities and rewrites the budget. And by the end, there's a compromise as far as how our priorities and the governor's priorities would coincide. The council does not have input, does not actively provide input on the budget at all. In the last couple of years, the budget the mayor submits is the budget they stamp. And on one hand, when you look at the things that are criminally underfunded in the city, such as resources for NORD, not just for recreational programs, but after school programming and facilities, we've not prioritized that. When you look at the uptick in juvenile crime in the city of New Orleans, it's tied to the fact that we under-resource every single alternative to prevent kids from going into crime. To add insult to injury, when the original Harris contract was signed in the 90s to create the casino, there was a tremendous set aside for the New Orleans Public School Board to provide monies for different educational activities. A big part of that, about $1.5 million, goes directly to the Travis Hill Center, which is the educational wing, the school inside the juvenile detention facility. So for kids who are brought in because of different issues that prevent them from being completely in their community for a set period of time, Travis Hill is where they go, so that then they leave that facility, they can go back to school. The council rewrote part of the Harris contract to take all the money from the Travis Hill Center in order to meet a campaign promise that many of them made to fund early childhood education. It created a couple of hundred slots. Well, what I would say is that, one, that is not money well spent, because the amount of slots needed for early childhood to make an impact are in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, in New Orleans. So defunding the only educational options for incarcerated kids who we're trying to prevent from going back into a life of crime to fund a couple of hundred early childhood slots, I think it was a terrible use of money. But more importantly, if early childhood education was a priority, they could have gone into the actual budget they have control over and allocated the money to pay for it. Rather than fight with the mayor over the budget, they cut the Travis Hill Center from the school board. And that's not what the council's supposed to do. The council is supposed to fight with any mayor for their priorities, but they don't. And like I said, it goes back to that earlier comment I made. The council has really lost its way in that it's supposed to be a counterweight to the mayor of the city of New Orleans. It's supposed to have its own solutions to problems and not just amen the ones that the mayor does that they like and do peanut gallery commentary to the ones they don't.
Well, I will say one thing that this council took on fairly early into its current term was the issue of short-term rentals. And I think there's room to debate whether they got to there, but they did take it on. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about balancing tourism and hospitality, which does create jobs and is driven by architecture and music and culture that's unique to New Orleans, that we do want to share with the world, balancing the tourism and hospitality industries with quality of life and affordability for permanent residents. Well, how do you think we can strike a balance there?
I think the city council made the short-term problem worse, to be candid. I think that when you talk about unlimited commercial properties having unlimited short-term rentals, when you talk about no protections from converting existing housing stock into short-term rentals, if it's in a commercial property like a residential apartment building, when you look at the fact that enforcement was mandated with zero teeth, I honestly can tell you, from having worked with advocates from across the city, that the housing crisis as it pertains to short-term rentals was accelerated after the council took on the issue. I think the problem with the short-term rental legislation and ordinance is that the first bill was completely busted. And when you try to amend a broken bill, you're just as likely to make it worse as fix it. I will tell you, as a candidate for council at large, we have to write a whole new short-term rental ordinance. The current one is completely full of loopholes. As I understand it, Helena Moreno and I both came out publicly 6 years ago, before the council took up the first short-term rental ordinance, and opposed it. Said this is a terrible idea. Do not do this, because other cities across the country, in particular San Francisco, said if you haven't let Airbnb and VRBO in yet, do not do this, because they will run your government, which is what has happened. So I do not think they're the only reason for the affordable houses crisis, but I do think that they have certainly aggravated and made the crisis worse. And I do think that they have a completely negative impact on our people that live here. In particular, there was a single line that was in the original legislation that was mysteriously scuttled that would have limited short-term rentals to one per block face. Could you imagine if that one line had stayed in the ordinance from 6 years ago? If you could only have one short-term rental per block. These are the kind of fundamental flaws that are in that ordinance. So I appreciate you think they took it on. I think they completely dropped the ball and made it worse. Now, as far as the relationship of the city with tourism, The reality is that for better or worse, until we diversify our economy, tourism is a very essential and large part of it. Workforce housing is a tremendous problem because we have created a city that is in desperate need of people to work jobs that pay below the poverty line, but we don't provide housing for anyone to live near said jobs. And increasingly, I meet people who used to live in Treme, used to live in the upper or lower 9th Ward, 7th Ward, Marigny Bywater, that now live in New Orleans and Slidell. And the cost of getting to work is pretty much making work unsustainable. I think that whenever we're talking about how we're going to interact with that industry, there has to be a very candid conversation that is just as important for that industry to work with the city council and the city to provide solutions and options than to simply protect their profit margins. I was one of the legislative leaders on the fair share legislation that went through the legislature that allowed the city of New Orleans to recapture more tourism dollars to the general fund for infrastructure. And the idea as it was sold to us was that as the city had more money from the tourism industry to tackle infrastructure, that would free up money to deal with other issues. That has not been the case because no one's really tracked where that money's gone and how it's being spent. I think that on a really basic level, we have to have a true accounting within the budget. What are our priorities, and are we allocating the necessary funds to promote said priorities? I think that when you look at the way the budget's currently allocated in the state of Louisiana, we have a committee called the Joint Committee on the Budget that meets monthly to review the budget and look for areas where there's complete divergence from what was previously established in the previous year's budget. The city council meets once a year to rubber stamp a budget. They have no idea how the departments are spending money on a monthly basis. They have no idea on how the things they're prioritized are being handled over the year, and they've given up all attempts to do so. I think that part of the council's job, the primary part, is the funding and the budget. And I think the council has to be more actively involved in the nuts and bolts of tracking the budget to make sure money is being spent in a way consistent with our values. Budgets are moral documents. If you think affordable housing is a priority, and I do, then I think that the council has to allocate resources, whether it's direct funding, whether it's incentives, whether it's having a actual plan to aggressively bring those 25,000 properties back into commerce as habitable dwellings. All these things, if they're important, should revolve around the budget, because that is where the council has its most powerful grasp around city government, and the council doesn't do anything with it. And that's it's very unfortunate, because I'll give you an example. Many council members will say, we have no control over fighting crime. Crime is the mayor's problem. She picks the police chief, yada, yada, yada. What people fail to remember, and many weren't here, so let's say you just don't know because you're new to here. In the 1990s, when crime was at a pandemic level, epidemic level, people were getting shot. We were the murder capital of the world for a decade. The reason why Richard Pennington was hired to clean up corruption in the police department is because the city council froze the NOPD's budget. They froze the NOPD's budget. They allocated them out their monthly disbursement like they were a bad kid with an allowance. And eventually the mayor capitulated to working with the council to do a national search for the police chief that will become Richard Pennington. People underestimate how much power resides in the city council when it comes to the budget. And a lot of that is because doing things like that, like picking that fight with the mayor over crime, require a level of gumption and leadership that this council currently lacks. Part of, I think, what makes politicians nervous is that they're afraid to take stands on things because that stand might end up being wrong. And I think there's certainly a logic to that. But at the same time, if you're not willing to stand for something, then you're kind of willing to fall for anything. And I am renowned, for better or worse, in my time as a legislator, I always took a stand on something. And even if that was the wrong stand and I had to correct it at a later date, it was fine. But I always said, this is what I want to do. this is what I stand for. I think it becomes very hard when you look at this city council and the direction it's taken over the last almost decade to find where people stand on issues and how they've tackled the issues that have perennially just hurt the city of New Orleans.
Yeah, I would agree that I think that there's a fundamental skill in politics, which is the ability to disagree with someone, and to do it forcefully, but not close the door to future discussions and conversation. Right. And this council has certainly a habit of voting unanimously, where there's not a lot of intercouncil debate that happens in the public.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is literally the thing that probably peeves me the most. This council has the most unanimous votes of any council in history, which on its face, people go, well, that's a good thing. I'm like, that's a terrible thing, because the legislative process, legislation and ordinances are like coal being converted to diamonds. The pressure and the conflict between conflicting ideas make something better. When you have, the council is not a beehive that is run by a queen bee or a hive brain. When the council has that many unanimous votes, it's typically because they're meeting not in public to agree on things. That is a huge disservice to the public. Every issue, especially significant ones, need to be aired and debated in public, so the public has an opportunity to shape what's going to ultimately happen. Because when you see unanimous votes, two things you can be assured of. One, the ultimate item does nothing. Because if it's unanimous, that means it's usually been watered down to the point where it actually accomplishes nothing. Or it's a controversial issue that by having a unanimous vote, they stifle public debate. Because when you don't have a council person who's a holdout saying, no, I really don't like this zoning issue, it makes me uncomfortable, I need to hear from the people out there who want to talk about it. When you have unanimous votes, that goes away. Because if they know it's a unanimous vote, they don't feel like they have any obligation to go to the public to hear alternative positions. Because if the council is established as a whole, this is their position, then what's the use of having those neighbors show up and say, I don't like that?
Well, as someone who watches a lot of city council meetings, I can tell you I would appreciate a little more conflict, because it's always more interesting to have some debate going on the dais, as someone who's sitting through the meetings. But let me turn us back quickly to preservation. Strictly speaking, as you know, the rehabilitation of historic buildings is also an economic driver for the city of New Orleans. The state historic tax credit combined with the federal historic tax credit has been able to create more than $200 million in investment and 3,000 construction jobs in this area last year alone, according to the State Office of Cultural Recreation and Tourism. So from your time in the legislature, the impact that the state historic tax credit has had in drawing investment to the city. And you probably are aware that it can be combined with things like low-income housing tax credits to create, and has created, hundreds of affordable housing units. I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can, as a city, leverage this asset that is our historic buildings, and leverage that opportunity in rehabilitating them to create equitable economic development.
Well, I mean, I think the city hasn't done enough to supercharge what's already there. When you look at those existing programs, they're still at a level where you really can only take advantage of them if you are a well-heeled or well-funded developer to make those initial spends to get that done. And when you're dealing with credits in particular, depending on the refundable or non-refundable nature, you have to deal with brokers to make sure the credits even get dispersed and you get your money back. And it all creates kind of a log jam where unless you've got the money on the front end to do something, you really can't utilize it on the back end. I think there's a lot of different local resources we have. Pilot comes to mind as the first one, obviously, the payment in lieu of taxes, where